Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Daunte Wright. All unarmed blacks murdered at the hands of the police. All received national attention and calls for police reforms. George Floyd's murder, much like Rodney King's brutal beating by police, was filmed by a bystander, and that footage made the world take notice of something all too familiar to black communities: police brutality and excessive force. But the issue is more than that. Blacks continue to fight to be seen as human amid a backdrop of white supremacy that can snuff out our lives at a moment's notice. America's method of policing has always been a problem. This is nothing new. In fact, the origins of policing were slave patrols. The original police were created to enforce slave laws. That included catching runaways, instilling fear in the enslaved, and maintaining the cash crop of free labor. Post-slavery, the police were used to enforce Jim Crow laws, ramp up voter intimidation to keep blacks from the polls, and many of the police top brass hid under white sheets, meanwhile leading KKK raids on black communities that dared ask for the equal rights assured them in the Constitution. Police brutality and excessive force only increased during the Civil Rights Movement, where peaceful protesters were beaten, many arrested, and several murdered. Fast forward to the failed war on drugs. Police brutality went into overdrive, directly targeting the black and brown community. Chokeholds, no-knock warrants, stop and frisk, interrogating youth with no parent or legal representative present, and of course, a broken taillight, selling loose squares, sleeping in your own bed, or having a faulty $20 bill is a death sentence. The George Floyd protests of 2020 led to a nationwide racial reckoning on Twitter. In real life, little substantive police reform ever occurred. The George Floyd Justice of Policing Act can't get enough votes from Republicans. Activists argue city-level reforms don't go far enough either. What will it take for police reforms to finally take shape? And what will those reforms look like? Here to answer that and more is former police officer and prosecutor Arthur Reiser and former Chicago police officer Dominick Izzo. Good to have you guys.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Dominick, I'm going to start with you. The cries for police reform have never been stronger than in 2020 when they took on a global presence due to the Black Lives Matter protests for George Floyd. Even with all of that national and international attention, federal legislation just hasn't gotten real traction. Why do you think that is, and what does the stall process mean for policing?
I think, number one, we have to look at your opening narrative and how far off base you were on so many things, all the way from law enforcement, starting from slave retention to where it actually started from where Sir Robert Peel in Europe. That's a different story. We also have to talk about the behavior of communities, law enforcement go in. Nobody's been more public or open about how abused the black community has been for as long as they've been here, and they still are. In Democrat cities, the blacks are still kept in slavery. All you have to do is look anywhere from their education system to the drugs pumped into their neighborhood, all the way to the court systems. That's a given. You want police reform? Take away what law enforcement is able to do. Nobody's talking about what cops are able to do on the streets. So when it comes down time to talking about police brutality, number one, people have to get educated on what use of force is, and the public isn't educated on that. Number two, you don't want war on drugs, then have the politicians change the laws to take away what the police are able to do. The bottom line is, unfortunately, we have bad quality candidates coming in. We have 21-year-olds still allowed to be police officers. We have a perpetuation of what the blacks look like online thanks to social media and their animalistic behavior. And then we have law enforcement out there who is crucified for doing their job. So we can blame cops all day, which is what the media loves to do. But until we start looking at the behavior, the criminality, and the actual facts behind the black community's contribution to this, none of what you're asking for is going to change.
So before we go any further, I'm going to say that a lot of that response was extremely offensive. First and foremost, we know that crime. I'm not finished. I let you finish. I'm going to continue. Critical race theory is something that we don't teach in this country because Republicans don't want to see it. But we know what the history is. With that being said, as a native of Chicago, whose family has lived there since the 50s, my father is a police chief in the city of Chicago today. So we think that the issues related to poverty, related to the fact that there has been so much devaluation of the black community in and of itself. When it comes to property, when it comes to schools taking funding. Sir, please let me finish. Sir.
The black community does not value black lives.
I am trying to be extremely respectful right now, but to say that black people do not value black lives is a blatant false statement, and I'm not going
It's
to allow
daily
you to
feed.
go on and say something like that. It is extremely offensive and completely
You're
wrong.
going to change your narrative in the
Extremely
opening then.
offensive and completely wrong.
So was your
There is
opening.
historical relevance to that opening, and I would suggest you Google it. But before we can, because there's not
have
going to be
Googled
any
it. I
agreement
lived
here, because what you
I
started
walked
with
it.
was extremely racist and it was problematic. And on this
understand.
show, we do not promote that.
You need to blame
We do
everyone
not
else
promote
but
that,
your
sir.
own community. I understand that. You should have gotten your facts better then.
Dominick, I'm going to move on to Arthur because I want to ask Arthur